Welcome all. Good afternoon. Uh, I know it's a lazy afternoon. We're all used to taking a nap. Please bear with me for 1 hour. Okay. So the topic of present webinar is ultra fast, ultra short, and ultra intense. So these are the three properties of a very beautiful laser system. So I would like to discuss briefly about what are these three important properties and what are the applications and opportunities with femtosecond laser. So this is my address, and you may always send emails, etc. Okay, anytime you want to talk to me or you want to meet me. Yeah. So what are we expected? What are you? What am I going to tell for the next 1 hour? It's important that we put some ground rules because the topic is extremely wide. Okay, so each each of this sentence, each of the statement, or each of the word has been explored, and there are books written on this. Okay, there are books, not even just one book. There are books written on each of these words, and there are more than 10,000 or 20,000. So I would say more than 1 lakh of papers which have come in this direction. So what am I going to speak for next 1 hour? So my intention is very simple. I thought I should introduce you what is this beautiful field of femtosecond laser, give you a gist of what are the various processes which one can study with these lasers, and what are the various processes that can be induced with these lasers. Okay, the point is we know light and matter, right? Light interacts with matter and matter interacts with light. So the interaction of this light interaction with matter and matter interaction with light becomes much more beautiful and rich when we start jacking up the intensities of this light. Why? We'll just discuss now. Okay, this is what I'm going to talk. So relax. There is nothing great about any mathematics. It's all about telling you a story. Just follow me, and then I hope at the end of this you would appreciate this field. And in case something more to be done, one can discuss further. Okay. So this is the prologue I want to say, and going by the theme of this session, light matter interaction, I thought I should start with something which is much more primitive. Forget all this, multi-core equipments we're talking about. Here I'm showing you a spectrometer, which has put us Indians in the map or scientific world. So this is nothing but Raman spectrograph. It's the very first Raman spectrum was obtained with this spectrograph, right? And this is in 1928. So all of you who are aware of this field of lasers, they know lasers have started. Lasers were invented in 1960, and now we may feel that without lasers, life is useless. And we see lasers in every field, almost everywhere you go, you observe, you find laser. So this particular work was done before the laser era, and that's where the beauty about it, right? So this is Professor C.V. Raman. In 1930, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and he happens to be the first non-white Indian or Asian person to receive Nobel Prize in the branch of science, and he is indigenous. Okay, so these two are the papers which have come as soon as he invented or he discovered this kind of this material, this phenomenon of Raman effect. I will not go in detail what is Raman effect. It's some scattering, which you all know. Okay, so both C.V. Raman and K.S. Krishnan. In fact, K.S. Krishnan was the person, is a professor, is the student of C.V. Raman who did all the work. And the beauty about this work is that it is extremely difficult to do. If we were Raman, if we were living in the time of 1928, and if you're asked to do this work, it could have been one of the most difficult, challenging problems. Why? Why? Because it is challenging. I would recommend you to buy this book or pick up this book wherever you can, Raman and His Effects by G. Venkatraman, and read so that you appreciate what's the big deal with this work. What's the big deal with this work? Okay, now Raman effect is something which very common people talk about it. Raman scattering is common because if you ask a student of 8th standard or 9th standard with a little bit of science background, you ask him what kind of scatterings are there, he would say Rayleigh scattering, Raman scattering. Okay, So this has become a school topic now, but once upon a time, it is something which no one knew about it, and it was one of the difficult things to discover. Why? Because before the laser was invented, the work was done only with the light sources which were avoided, which was obtained, and these light sources are not intense. Okay, so during the time, people are working with mercury arc lamp, and it so happened that the period in which Raman was working, he didn't even have the access to the mercury vapor lamp. Rather, he did not know how to play with it, and so he thought, let's start working with sun. Now, sun, sun changes its angle every time, right? So how do you do the experiment? For that, they worked with this so-called heliostat, where this simple arrangement changes the direction, so that as the sun is changing its direction, this guy would rotate such that the direction of the input radiation into the lab remains the same. Okay, so this is the kind of lab where K.S. Krishnan has worked and started observing this feeble fluorescence, which they started talking about it initially, and the so-called secondary radiations, which they named it later, and which now have become the so-called Raman scattering. Okay, so what did they do is indigenous way of looking at the complementary filters. Sunlight has all the white light. Now, how do you do what you want? So for that, Raman has developed his own filter systems. Okay, he has developed his own filter systems to pick out what kind of light he wants. And all these things are his own indigenous ideas. And eventually he found it is difficult to do work like this. And then he invented this spectrograph, which I just showed you in the first slide. Okay, with that spectrograph, they published the paper in May 5th, 1928 in Nature, where they started looking at this small radiations which are coming next to the Rayleigh scattering. Okay, this is the incident radiation 1. Okay, spectrum of the incident light. 2 is the spectrum of the scattered light. And you see, along with this bright scattering which is there are some secondary small lines which you see, A, B, C, and these are the ones which were new. And K.S. Krishnan says that irrespective of the slides, the liquids they have used, irrespective of the liquids, they have tried for 60 odd liquids. If you open this paper, you'll know the scattering remains the same. Okay, and so it was the birth of this new field called Raman scattering. Just to give a reason why it is such an important work at that time is, if you look at the Rayleigh scattering, it is 0.1 to 0.01% related to the radiation source. However, if you talk about this particular Raman, it is approximately 1 in 10 million that can be scattered inelastically. Okay, and so the probability of seeing a Raman scattered photon is such a big thing. And if you assume your light source is weak, then imagine how weak the scattering will be. Okay, so that is the beauty about the work, and we should continue taking inspiration from such beautiful scientists who have done indigenous work those days, and continue our work. Now we always wonder, what if Raman would have done had he got the access to the lasers then? Because laser is a game changer. In all optics, laser has been a game changer. What is laser? This is the inventor of laser, Ted Neyman, and it was done in 1960. Okay, so we all know the history of laser and spectroscopy changed forever thereafter. It's a really game changer, and this is this ruby laser which he has invented in 1960. Okay, so just to give one small quick slide on what is laser. Laser is a system, is a device consisting of 3 components. You have the end mirrors which act as a resonator. You have an active medium where you have this absorption and stimulated emission events, which is induced by the pump. So 3: pump, active medium, and the end mirrors, which gives you the complete laser. And what you get out would be a steady output, which you call as laser output, and there are three important properties which put aside a laser with other kind of light sources are the monochromaticity, divergence, and coherence. Okay, these things we keep telling the students. I'm sure most of the audience here are faculty in various colleges. So this is something which we teach in the applied physics course to the BTech. So monochromaticity, divergence, coherence. I would just give small description of each of this for our own memory refreshing. What is coherence? If you look at incoherent waves, we say that these are a bunch of waves which have no relationship to each other. Let's say there's no phase relationship to each other. They don't start at the same point in space and time. Why that is important? To understand where they start in space and time. This is because if you take this bunch of waves, each wave is beautiful color, but if you mix them together, you will not see anything because there is no phase relationship with each other and they do not interfere. On the other hand, coherent waves are those where they exhibit a certain phase relationship with each other. They are locked together in space and time, and the distance they travel as the same lock, having the same phase difference, we call that as the coherence length. Okay, and the time in which they remain together is called the coherence time. Okay, so just look at this this particular URL or just type coherence and you will see whatever I'm talking about it. Next comes the divergence. And now divergence is something which we take it for granted because all of us are used to giving talks with laser pointers. That is the simplest example of the directionality of a laser. You can go at the back side of the class and just point out to the screen and show what you want to show. Okay, so this is a software generated laser pointer, so nothing great about it, but then you can understand what is the actual laser pointer. Now comes the monochromaticity. I have put it as at the end because that is something which is very interesting when we start thinking about the light and the various radiation sources which are possible. One of the most primitive radiation source which is known to humankind is a black body radiation. Okay, and the energy per unit area, per unit wavelength, okay, is du by d lambda 4 pi kt by lambda power 4. So this says that the energy per unit volume per unit length is proportional to the temperature, or the higher the temperature, higher would be the power density which comes out. Correct? So what do you infer? What do we infer from this? If I want to pick out a light, okay, a light of certain wavelength, let's say around 500 nanometers, and if I want to have a strong power density at that 500 nanometers, I should keep on increasing the temperature of this black body. Okay, only then I can expect a strong emission of a certain wavelength region. Okay, do not get confused with the white light. So if I increase the power, if I increase the temperature, the output is very strong, but then that output has the entire wavelength region. This entire black body radiation is there. So my interest is to see how strong I can get a certain small wavelength range. Okay, then comes the ubiquitous laser. So this is an example of a helium laser operating at 632.8 nanometers with an output power of 1 milliwatt and 1 millimeter diameter. So all those who do experiment in the lab are aware of this very, very basic laser, right? Maybe in your labs you might have 5 milliwatt, 10 milliwatt. I'm giving an example of 1 milliwatt, which is extremely weak from our point of view, and having a diameter of 1 millimeter. Okay, so this is the description of this laser. And if I want to compare how much of temperature I need to increase to the black body, if I want to heat up the black body, what is the effective black body temperature of the laser beam as it emerges from this laser output? Okay, so my question is simple. I am getting with this laser 632.8 nanometers of 1 milliwatt output. If I want this 1 milliwatt output from a black body radiation exactly at 632.8, what is the temperature I should heat? Okay, I request you to check out this beautiful problem in Laser Fundamentals textbook, Self-Fast. Okay, those of you who do not have, please get back to me. I will send you that nice example problem. So the answer is this: you need to heat the black body to a temperature of 19,60,000 Kelvin. It is 19,60,000 Kelvin. Look here, we are talking about 600 Kelvin, and normally we put 600 Kelvin because this is the kind of energies we get from light, from sun, okay, from the sun. This is the kind of, so sun is burning at the temperature. That's what we say. It's burning, sun is not burning at the temperature, but the amount of light we receive on Earth is equivalent to this particular temperature, around 6,000 Kelvin. And so, if I want to get similar light output from the sun, I cannot get. If I want to have my own artificial radiation source, then I need to heat that particular black body radiation, black body, to a temperature of 19,60,000 Kelvin. So this calculation indicates that the radiation intensity of laser beam inside the laser cavity has a value equivalent to that of nearly 20 lakh Kelvin black body, if you consider only the radiation emitted from the black body and the frequency over which the laser operates. So this particular slide, I want you to sit back and appreciate how much of advantage we get with the laser. As simple as a simple 1 milliwatt laser. You take a laser pointer and you heat and you look at the how much of output you get. It will be about that. So this 1 milliwatt laser, which we buy from, normally we go to even right now I see in some Sabji Saturdays, weekends, weekend shoppings, etc. on the streets. People are selling this China made ones for 50 rupees, 60 rupees. Now we never appreciate the amount of light that we get, because if there was no laser and if we were working with the kind of sources which were there before the laser, we would never have achieved what we are able to achieve. Okay. So now, having sensitized you with the beauty of the laser, let's get into the time scales. Okay. Now, it's not just the energy and the intensity which a laser gives, it's also the control over the time which we can get it. So this half slide tells you the incoherent light which we get and the time scales which we are all used to it. The age of universe is considered to be 4.2 10 power 17 seconds. The average life of man, we say 100 years, is equivalent to 10 power 9 seconds. And our heartbeat is 1 second. Okay, this is the time which with incoherent light we can easily take it, right? Why we can say heartbeat? Because you can, with flash photography, can pick up all these things. Now comes the laser, because with the laser you can start getting the control over processes or control over your capability of understanding the processes in much faster time scales. So here I give you 3 examples. A macromolecular dynamics is a big molecule like DNA or something, happens in 10 power minus 9 seconds, which is nanosecond. A molecular motion, which is here, twisting of molecules, rotating of molecules, etc., whatever is happening, chemical reactions, typically happen within 10 power minus 12 to 10 power minus 15 seconds, which is a picosecond to the femtosecond. And finally, the electronic motion. Okay, so this is a example of a electron going around the nucleus ground. And this happens within 10 power minus 18, which is the attosecond. So now, with the advent of lasers and with the advent of pulse lasers, we are able to understand or probe or take pictures of all these various processes which we are able to, which we could not have done without the laser. Okay, so this is a simple understanding of what all timescales mean. Okay, next comes the discussion between some pulse laser and a CW laser. Now, all the laser pointers which we are aware of is a steady output, it's a CW laser, or the laser like the helium laser in the lab is a steady output, right? You get a constant output, so which is why we call it a CW laser. So the power is always constant. Okay, if you take power versus time, you get a flat line, right? Now, how do I make this guy pulsed? I can chop it, correct? I can just on off, on off, on off. I can put on off, on off. In that case, what happens? I would still get the same power, but intermittent bursts of this power, top, 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 I can get. Now, is this considered as a pulse laser? No, because here, irrespective of the pulses we are able to get, the energy or the power which we can get as within the time which is coming is very little. Okay, it is similar to the average power. On the other hand, we call a pulse laser as that where the energy is contained in short time scale and released out. Okay, so if I want to take a output of a power pulse laser which is looking at this and look at the average power output. So put a photo detector and see how is the energy coming, how is the power coming out. So that power is averaged over the time. So I would still end up getting a low average power. Okay, so if you take these three and integrate over this entire time from here to here, you end up getting a peak which is a flat line. On the other hand, if I look at individual powers that is coming as small bursts in time, I have high pulse power. Okay, high peak power per pulse. So this is how one can distinguish a CW laser to a pulse laser, and this is the same thing in a much easier way. Okay, you can have a high peak output power for a pulse laser, whereas the average power still remains the same. So these two are same, doing this and this are telling the same thing. So I have a CW laser and a pulse laser having the same average output power. Let's say it is 1 milliwatt both. However, if I say that this guy is a pulse laser, then I can expect the peak output power as a function of time or as a function of the pulse width to be higher. Okay, so that's how we distinguish pulse laser and CW laser. So the point here is that in pulse laser, I can expect lot of energy being dumped out of the laser in short period of time. These are various symbols and units of pulse parameters. You can talk about pulse period, okay, the distance duration between two pulses, a repetition rate, which is inverse of this period. You have the pulse energy, okay, which is the total energy which is contained in each pulse. Okay, then you have this pulse width, which is the duration of the pulse. Okay, duration of the pulse. Then you have the average power, which I said as earlier. When you integrate all these things over a period of time, the average power comes down. So this is equivalent to a CW output if this guy is taken as CW output. And then the peak power, where what is the maximum power you can get per pulse. Okay, so these are the various points to keep in mind when we talk about a pulse laser. Furthermore, because we are talking about a pulse laser, there should be a understanding about the duration, right? So the shorter the duration, higher is the peak power, peak pulse. This is very easy to remember. You take a string, and then you keep bringing them together. As you keep bringing them together, the material of the string starts getting rising like this. So this is how it is. Let's say this is the pulse, and let's say this is the string I have. If I start pushing it down in that direction, the material starts resisting and it starts showing up a peak like this. So the shorter the period duration, higher is this pulse. So that is the idea of the peak pulse power. Okay, P peak equal to E by tau. Peak power and average power can be calculated like this. Okay, by this equation. What are the two important parameters for this? Is the fluence and intensity. Okay, this is a laser pulse per effective focal area, laser peak power per effective focal spot. Okay, joule per centimeter square and watt per centimeter square. Again, the duration is hidden in this peak power. Okay, peak power or pulse energy. So E by tau is already there. So intensities can be much higher if tau is small. This is something which one needs to keep in mind. Okay, another point is the beam is Gaussian. Okay, so beam is Gaussian, laser beams are Gaussian, so the intensity is highest at the central part of it. So if you focus it further, then the intensities can be much higher in this region. Okay? So focus strings are very simple. Now let's see how I generate a nanosecond pulse. This is there's a common technique called Q-stitching. Okay, this is a standard thing which we teach to the school, to the college students, how we can get a laser. Okay, so the point here is that you keep pumping the upper level such that you still have spontaneous emission, but you put a block in the resonator. So because there's a block in the resonator, the stimulated emission doesn't occur. The resonator is zero, so there is a very high loss in the system. Then you open that light modulator, you just open it up, and so suddenly all the upper level population which is there suddenly sees a high resonator high Q resonator or the optical resonator, because of which you have a fast buildup of stimulated emission photons, which fast buildup of stimulated emission photons, which starts coming out as a laser pulse. Now, how fast? Now, how long will that happen? Till the upper level is completely lost, the excited state. Till the upper level population is completely depleted. So the depletion of the optical cavity, once all the atoms are returned to the ground state, would stop the output. So the time difference between you opening this shutter and the depletion of this upper level gives you the actual giant optical pulse, which we call as the nanosecond pulse. So this is how it is. You have, hold on please. Okay, so you have the maximum loss, then you have the gain, which happens like this, and you suddenly release both of them. So the gain increases, stimulated emission processing photons increases, and it will keep on getting increased. It gets saturated, and then once it gets saturated, this laser pulse starts coming up. And how long it will grow? Till the upper level population is depleted. So once the population is depleted, there is no output because there is no stimulated emission, and that's how this particular laser output is there. And the timing is typically in nanoseconds. Okay, typically is nanoseconds. So using this one can get nanosecond pulses. Now, how do I do something much shorter than nanosecond? So this is a way forward for nanosecond pulse. For this, we cannot really do whatever jugaad we did earlier. Rather, we can start thinking from the waves point of view. Again, I started earlier with the coherence, right? Now let's see, I have 3 waves of different frequencies, omega 2, omega 3, omega, and they do not have any phase relation with each other. You see the starting point are totally random. So when you mix these 3, when you superpose these 3, the total amplitude is a random noise. And if you take a intensity, which is square of this amplitude, what you get is again a random noise. However, if I take the same 3 waves and let them start together, so you see the starting point, let them start together. In that case, there is a possibility of superposition, such that there is always some points where you have the maximum overlap, and that's what starts showing up as a peak in the total field amplitude, followed by dips, and the intensity, which is square of this, shows up this as this. You have very high peak and noise, peak noise, peak noise, and that's how you can obtain the so-called mode locking. So by mode locking, inherently what we're doing is we pick up certain modes, let them start together, and look at the superposition of them. When we do that, this bunch of modes start building up together to give us the mode locking. So this is how we define mode locking is achieved by combining in phase a number of distinct longitudinal modes of a laser, all having slightly different frequencies. You lock it, and what you end up is a ultra short pulse, which is this. This ultra short pulse, right? And then what will be the period of this? This period can be given like this. I'll just come to that soon. So again, look at this line. The shorter the number of modes, the shorter is the height. Higher the number of modes, higher is the intensity. So if you want to get much short pulse, you need to have much more modes, much higher number of modes as together, collecting together. This is the idea of this. And the difference between this and this is resonator round trend. And so one can define the T separation as the time it takes between these two, and the pulse duration of this as T1 by delta nu n. N is the number of modes you're able to mix in order to get the mode locking. And so what I have is the so-called time bandwidth product. And how does it look from a spectrum and time period point of view? This is the spectral width and this is the wavelength. So shorter is the frequency bandwidth or the wavelength bandwidth. Shorter is the frequency bandwidth or the higher is the pulse duration. Higher is the frequency bandwidth. Shorter is the pulse duration. Clear? So in order to get a 50 femtosecond pulse or a 10 femtosecond pulse, I should have lot of modes being mode locked together, and so the overall bandwidth which we see is much broader. Compare this with what you have in helium neon laser. Helium neon laser is 632.8 nanometers, so you are sure about 0.1 nanometer plus or minus. Only then you write it like significant is it. However, here you're talking about 10 nanometers, 100 nanometers, and so on. So this is the typical cavity arrangement of the Ti-sapphire laser, which is a standard material for femtosecond pulse. Again, Ti-sapphire is used because titanium has a very broadband fluorescence emission, and so it is easier to find the set of number of modes to mode lock in order to get much shorter pulse duration. That's the idea of this thing. And again, this is how it is. Here I have frequency, short the time period, and again the field would vary as you see here. Okay, that's the idea of this, and these are all typically Fourier transform. Okay, you can Fourier transform this to get this. I would recommend all of you to look at this web page, frop.gatech.edu/pros.html. This is run by Professor Rick Trebino, RICK Rick Trebino, and he has done a lot of work on this direction. He has written a lot of PPTs, and he has given it for free to everybody. So please check it and learn things. Now, what is the problem with this kind of thing? When you have a broad bandwidth, we know different frequencies travel at different speeds in light, in different speeds in metal medium. If you take a glass, in the same thickness of glass, different wavelengths go at different speeds. And so what I would end up is having a group velocity dispersion. When I have a bunch of frequencies traveling through a thick glass medium, each of the wavelength will have its own frequency, own velocity, and overall what happens is some travel faster and some travel slower. Resultantly, the bunch which we start as a short pulse, time to time periodically, a time period wise, it gets broadened. And that's why what people do is they do a reverse phenomena called the pulse compressor, okay, to avoid the group velocity dispersion. How do they do it? You start with a dispersed light, okay. Now let it go through a prism. Now the prism is bent such that different frequencies are traveling at different lengths of the prism, okay. So overall they get inversed. So this is here and this blue is up here, so it gets inversed, and then they are sent through an opposite prism, okay, which looks like this, because of which now this guy is traveling to this prism much smaller distance compared to this, okay. So here you let them start together, they have their own times of delay, and then you let them travel through the glass based on the calculations. One can do the calculations. So overall what happens, you can make sure that the delay it is happening because of the time, okay, can be compensated with the delay because of the distance it travels to the glass, and that's how one can have this negative group velocity dispersion and hence the compensation. So overall you can start like this and end up getting a much smaller pulse duration, okay. This is pretty common in all the femtosecond pulse femtosecond cavities. As you see, this is the prism pair, okay. This is just a prism pair with the second one, okay. That's the idea of it. Now each ultra fast laser pulse has an intensity and phase versus time relationship. As you see here, this is the intensity, this is the phase, and this is the carrier frequency, okay. A sharply peaked function for the intensity yields an ultra short pulse. The phase tells us the color evolution of the pulse in time, okay. That's the phase typically tells you how is this particular different colors which are evolving in time, and that's how most of the time when you type of femtosecond pulses in Google, you will start seeing a variation which looks like this. As you see, this guy is much faster than this, so this is a so-called chirped pulse, okay. Then comes the very important point of how do I amplify my femtosecond pulse. Why it is a big problem to amplify femtosecond pulse? The problem is simple. Even though the powers and energies are less, if they focus, by virtue of their short pulse duration, the intensities are high. Because the intensities are very high, they start damaging all the optics which is there inside the cavity. And therefore, people found it difficult to amplify the output. And for many years, no one could do much work because by virtue of by the way the mode locking happens, there is not much of pulse amplification that happens within the cavity. So most of the femtosecond oscillators were giving only nanosecond outputs. Sorry, nanojoules outputs. It's not very high. And so then came this work by these two Nobel laureates who got prize in 2018, Gerard Mourou and Donna Strickland, and they started this field, this new concept called chirp pulse amplification. So what do they do is simple. They know a short pulse would create problem. So what I do, I stretch it. I chirp it by a factor of 1000. A 100 femtosecond pulse gets chirped 100 picoseconds. Now, 100 picoseconds would not have high intensities. And so one can amplify it using various laser cavities to get the kind of amplification you want. A 1 millijoule, a 100 nanojoule laser pulse can be amplified to 1 millijoule amplification energy. So once a 1 millijoule 100 picosecond laser is obtained, you can do the kind of GVD compensation which I just explained in the previous slide with the prisms. Here we talk in terms of the grating. So just the same thing one can do, and overall you can start with initial short pulse and obtain with a very high energy short pulse. So this is called the chirped pulse amplification. You chirp the pulse and amplify and come back and de-chirp it, okay, or recompress it to get the short pulse. So this is a game changer. There is a talk following my talk who would talk more about it. So I will not go in detail about this. Please look for that. Now, let's ask, we need such short pulses. Do we really need it? The answer is yes. If not, I will not give the talk and people like me will be jobless. There is another fact to it. The fact is, typically a low energy femtosecond laser pulse costs 2 to 6 crores. And a high energy laser may cost anything more than 50 crores. I know one of the institutes in India got 150 crore funding to get much higher power or petawatt laser. Now, why do we invest in so much of money? What is the requirement? This is where the title of the talk comes in: ultra fast, ultra short, and ultra intense. So these three properties are very unique to femtosecond pulses. Okay. With ultra short pulse duration, I can do this transient optical spectroscopy, which one can call as femtochemistry, femtophysics, or whatever, in order to study the chemical reactions and follow whatever is happening at that femtosecond time space. And can also have the so-called ultra fast camera to make a molecular movie. So you can, in principle, track how the molecule is evolving over time. Overall, our interest is to unravel the primary photo events of nature, and one can do various things like this. So this is how ultra short pulse duration helps us. Now with the ultra short pulse duration, what I have is ultra high intensities. And why do I need such high intensities? I'm talking about very high intensities, which is beyond 10 power 12 watt per centimeter square. So at that such high intensities, one can explore laser plasma interactions. One can think of tabletop ion accelerators or particle accelerators. Nowadays, if you want to have an accelerator, you need to go to a synchrotron center, right? CERN, etc. So huge space to accelerate it. Now one can do such things with simple femtosecond pulse, high energy femtosecond pulse on a table. When you say tabletop, it's not our office table, it's an optical table. Then the holy grail of the entire field of high energy, high laser, ultra high energy laser pulses, which is the laser induced fusion. Okay, so all these things are possible to do it. Now, one thing which I left out is the ultra fast. Ultra short and ultra intense are self-explanatory. Now, what is ultra fast? The idea is here simple. Ultra short enables observation of ultra fast events. Therefore, these lasers are called ultra short laser pulse, and the research area is called ultra fast optics. Okay, so this is how the term ultra fast can be defined. Okay, there is some other part, some other way of talking about it. Typically, these laser pulses come at the frequency of 80 megahertz. So people may say these are all fast repetition, but a correct way of representing is that this laser pulses can allow us to study ultra fast events, and that's why these are called ultra fast phenomena. Okay, now where do we reach now? What is the timeline of these laser pulses? 100 microseconds to few, let's say 1 microsecond, one can get by simple modulation. So a seed wheel laser is sufficient. Beyond that, if you want to compress it, if you want to reduce the power pulse width, I can start taking this journey in these areas. So here, the Q switching was invented sometime around 1965, and till 1970, almost 1970, okay, close to 1970, mode locking was not discovered. As you see here, the moment the laser was invented, the idea was to start exploiting the intensities that can come. Okay, and so immediately people started working on the making the short pulses, and that's how within 10 years we have the mode locking pulses, mode locking lasers, which is, let's say, the femtosecond pulse itself is almost generated before 1975. The first mode lock pulses were for picosecond laser. Then the field saturated for some time. We waited till those two brilliant scientists came up with the idea of Chauve pulse amplification. And with Chauve pulse amplification, much higher energies were possible. With high energies, higher order nonlinear phenomena was possible. Because of that, one could do few more advances in terms of compression, and so they started compressing these femtosecond pulses into few nanoseconds, few femtoseconds. In fact, this guy and here, these are all in the these two hollow core fiber, etc. They talk about generation of the shortest femtosecond, 4 femtosecond pulse. Okay, and then went further down towards generation of XUV pulse, extreme ultraviolet pulse, soft X-ray pulses, and all these things happen in this attosecond timescales. Okay, so Dipole Photonics 2019 gives you a complete information of all these things. Please check it. Now, what are the applications and opportunities? Again, this is self-explanatory. I can have nonlinear optics, picosecond, nanosecond, femtosecond pulses with these things. Molecular dynamics happening within 100 to 100 picoseconds. Okay, the standard things. Beyond that, if you want to start looking at the femtosecond time scales, I can have ultra-fast nuclear dynamics in molecular pulses, strong field laser atom interaction. Okay, so this would lead to this strong field ionization, high order harmonic generation. And if you want to crank up the power some more, I can start looking at multi-photon induced ionization, XUV pump probe studies. Then you have attosecond metrology, electron dynamics. So these are the various possibilities one can explore. Okay, by reducing the power and reducing the pulse duration and cranking up the intensity. Okay, the next talk is on filamentation and what all one can do by cranking up the intensity. So I'll leave it to the next speaker. Okay, I will move further with this. Right. So all this while I've been talking about femtosecond. What is a femtosecond? I'm sorry, I should not have kept this particular thing at this point. Okay. Okay.
Dr. Santosh.
Yeah.
You have 10 minutes of time.
Yeah, sure. I'm done. I'll be done by 10 minutes.
Okay,
no problem.
thank you.
Okay. So this point I wanted to answer at the end because it gives us a feel of what all we are able to achieve with this. And now you can sort of appreciate what I mean by intuitive feeling for femtosecond pulse. If you simply take a light wave of 800 nanometers, velocity is 3 × 10⁸ meter per second, I can calculate the time period to be 2.68 × 10⁻⁻15 femtoseconds. Okay. So, in other words, a femtosecond pulse, a femtosecond represents the time period in which a light wave of 800 nanometers just completes half of a second, just half of a second. It's not even ready to finish the entire wavelength. Okay. So the unique properties of femtosecond pulse is this: energy can be concentrated in short temporal intervals, several 10⁻⁻15 seconds. The geometrical path length of single femtosecond pulse amounts to few microns. Okay. So this few microns meaning a 150-second pulse can be concentrated into 30 micron in space, because of which I can start studying the fast processes using extremely high time resolution. All I need is to delay the two pulses by 30 microns in order to obtain the 150-second time resolution. Much shorter pulse duration. Okay, so this is how I can do it. And importantly, the pulse peak power can be extremely large, even at moderate pulse energies. Just to give an example, for 150 seconds with energy of 1 millijoule and repetition rate of 1 kilohertz, I can focus this pulse, okay, with a peak, which has a peak power of 1 gigawatt, into 100 microns to obtain 13 to 10 to the power 12 watt per centimeter square. So this is a very, very high energies. So where does it imply? I can start observing the so-called nonlinear optical effects at these intensities. Okay, the subject becomes much richer because the pulse affects itself, and also the metal affects the pulse. So overall, everything starts changing itself. Okay, and that's where the nonlinear optical effect comes into picture. Nonlinearity is simple. The polarization is no more directly proportional to the electric field, but with higher increase in the electric field, it becomes P is proportional to E square, E cube, and so on. So I can write it as P linear, polarization linear versus polarization nonlinear. Okay, so here it is worthwhile to remember what Professor Shen said. Physics would be dull and life most unfulfilling. Would be dull and life most unfulfilling if all physical phenomena around us were linear. Okay, linearization beautifies physics, but nonlinearity provides excitement. So we are talking about excitement, right? Right. So I'll just quickly zoom through this part because I know there is a talk on nonlinear optics. The important point which I want you to consider here is that in order to even get the second order nonlinear term, I need to have intensities or electric field to be overall 106 volt per centimeter square, or optical power density of 109 watt per meter square. Okay, so just to obtain or observe second order nonlinear phenomena, I need to have an optical power density of 109 watt per meter square. And if I compare that with what I get from sunlight, it would be 20 watt per meter square. Okay, so with sunlight one cannot observe, and so one had to wait till lasers have come. The moment lasers have come, the second order nonlinearity was obtained, and this result really signified the birth of nonlinear optics. And we know after 61 it's all history. Now what happens? What are the possible problems what are the possible things which can happen? The first thing is whole beam self-focusing. Okay, so again I'll jump through because the next talk is about these things. The point here is that the beam would start acting like a lens. The high intensity laser, when it travels through a thick optical medium, okay, there is a change in the refractive index, which we call as the nonlinear refractive index, n is equal to n0 plus n2y. With high intensity, the component of n2y increases. Resultantly, as you see, it is a Gaussian beam with high intensity at the center and low intensity at these corners. The nonlinear refractive index changes, and resultantly, the wavefronts start changing, and overall, this medium acts like a lens, and that's where we have the concept of self-focusing happening in the nonlinear optical medium. Okay, the focal power of this medium increases with increase in intensity. Second thing is in self-phase modulation, where it's not just the wavefronts which is changing, it is also the phase term changes. As I said in the earlier slide, phase term represents how the propagation of various frequencies happen. Now self-phase modulation talks about how these frequencies are changing. Okay, so these frequencies will change as a function of the phase will change as a function of intensity. Resultantly, there is a time varying phase happening, and that would appear as if when you start with a perfectly symmetric pulse, you have blue having faster and red slowing down. This again a chirp which is opposite to what we have in group velocity dispersion. And another point which one need to understand by this particular slide is that if I start with this initial and final slide, if I start with initial and output pulse, even though the pulse shape remains the same in terms of time, in terms of period, but in terms of the frequencies which are developed, you can have newer frequencies possible. Okay, so if you look at the time period before and after, it is still the same 2 picoseconds or 1 picosecond in this example, However, if I look at the way the frequencies have come, there is a possibility of newer frequencies generated, and that's why the self-induced broadening happens, has a very great effect in input pulse. And overall, when the 50-second pulse travels through a medium, it can come out with various new frequencies, which we call as continuum. So this superconductum generation is a very, very unique thing about a 50-second pulse. This is the point. When you focus a laser into a transparent medium, you get this white light. Okay, and the beauty about this white light is it maintains the spatial coherence, and also the duration of the pulse duration of each of the individual wavelengths which comes out would be similar to that of the input wavelength, input radiation. So if you start with 100 femtosecond, you end up getting 100 femtosecond or so for each of the input pulse. And so various things are possible, as I just show you. These are the various possibilities. You have stimulated Raman, parametric Fourier mixing, temporal self-shifting. These are the various interplay of nonlinear optical phenomena that is happening at such high intensities, which is resulting in the kind of output you see. So as you see here, it's not just the material behaving or acting to the material, to the light. It's just the light is also changing itself. Okay. So this is a simple video of what is white light. You start with a 80 nanometer pulse, okay, and then you end up getting complete white light. So you have a white light generation with focusing of femtosecond pulse. This material is a photonic crystal fiber. Okay. Now, what is ultra intense here? As I said earlier, you can keep on cranking up the power, and with different powers, one can start looking at various important questions. As you see here, this particular paper talks about the various high energy material, high energy physics questions, supernova explosion, nebulas, gamma ray bursts, burning plasmas, source of highest energy cosmic rays. All this can be nicely studied with the kind of intensities which is available with femtosecond pulses. Okay. Now I'll just spend 5 more minutes to finish my slide. Please wait for me, Arun. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah. So now, so this is about ultra intense, how much it comes. I will not go much in detail because they are very involved in terms of mathematics, as well as it's a big field by itself. I will just give few examples of what can be done, okay, in a day-to-day basis with the kind of lasers which is available with all of us. So one of the first things which I thought I will give you is the application in material processing. Okay, this field has developed over last decade, and now it is becoming a technological industry relevance. Okay, so the first thing one can think about is the direct writing of buried waveguides and microfluidic channels. So idea is simple. You focus a femtosecond pulse into a transparent block like glass or polymer or something, and as you see in the previous slides, the high intensities are able to modify the wave refractive index. So here I can always find the intensity such that there is a permanent change in the refractive index. Okay, so the point is, if I slide this block along in this direction, so at the focal spot, I have very high intensities, and these high intensities would result in a permanent change in the refractive index, resulting in the so-called waveguides. This is an example of writing of waveguides and microfluidic channels. Look at this paper, Optica, 2015. Okay, and our own work we did 10 years back, where we have written various structures. Okay, in fact, this is a waveguide, and this is the output of the waveguide mode profile. And apart from that, we could really play with it and make a lot of sub-nano structures, beautiful structures. Just keep writing. This is a waveguide, just like how artists draw pen on paper. We were just doing it on glasses. Okay, this is the idea of that. The second part is the direct writing of 3D fabrication of optical elements. You can really play with the material system and develop new optical elements, intricate optical elements. You can have, this is an example of making scaffolds for biomedical applications. These are all possible with direct writing. The third one is the 2-photon polymerization. So you can polymerize. Polymerization is typically done with chemical ways. Here, just by heating it, you can selectively polymerize certain area, and then you can make the scaffolds which look so beautiful. So this kind of scaffolds can be again used in the kind of things. So overall, if you see this, it's really a beautiful way of developing a three-dimensional structure. Okay, so you have a 3D printer with femtosecond lasers. Okay, look at this paper, which is the latest 2020 paper, which talks about all these things. Then comes the application in medical field. We all are aware of this LASIK. Okay, so a femtosecond LASIK is now one of the most popular thing, and people are using it. Most of the expensive, well-established eye hospitals have this femtosecond laser LASIK. Okay, the idea is again the same. You can change, just take out the flap, and then using the intensity, one can make local modifications in the eye. And they say that because the overall energy is less, it will not affect the direction. It will not affect whatever happens on the way. It will be like equivalent to a CW output. But when it focuses at the focal spot, it would cut it like a butter. Okay, if you take a hot knife and just slice along the butter would not go, but it just comes out. So that's the idea of this thing. Then finally, I would stop my discussion with the ultrafast spectroscopy. Okay, so this is again another beautiful field which is exploding everywhere. In fact, I work in this direction. Okay, so various time scales have various significance. Okay, if you look at this 10 to the power 12 to minus 14, you have this transition states, reaction intermediates. So you have various fundamental processes happening, physical processes happening, okay, chemical processes happening, biological processes. You know, photosynthesis happens within the picosecond to femtosecond time scales. Okay, the vibrational motion happens within the hundreds of femtoseconds, and so on. Okay, so this slide really summarizes all that can happen within the time scales, and with femtosecond pump probe spectroscopy, one can look at these things. So Professor Ahmed Javier got his 1999 Nobel Prize doing exactly this work, where he could develop a molecular movie. He could follow a chemical reaction and make a movie out of it, just like this. Okay, so you can follow up the excited state dynamics. You can see what happens at excited state, how the product is happening in ground state. So all these photo products we can start studying in this thing. Okay, so what is pump probe? Its idea is very simple. You have a pump, you have a sample which you're pumping, and then you come with a probe after a certain delay, and you look at the pump induced changes in the transmission for the probe. Okay, that you start, this is a detector, you put it. So all we are doing is looking at the transmission of this probe in the presence of pump. Okay, so if you take the pump pulse and the probe pulse as this, and the impulsive response of the medium as this, then all we are studying is a pump induced variation of probe energy. Okay, and as you see here, the product is a convolution of system response and the cross correlation of pump and probe poles. So the shorter the pump and probe, the shorter is the dynamic evolution, which we can see. So therefore, all dynamical processes within the cross correlation time are averaged out. What does it imply is that if I want to study a 100 femtosecond pulse, then I cannot use a 1 picosecond pulse to study. I need to have a 100 femtosecond pulse or lesser than that to study an event which is happening in 100 femtosecond. So this is a bit complicated experimental setup. This is the thing it is. Various experimental requirements for it. You have spectral coverage, which needs to be very high, extreme temporal resolution, high sensitivity, good sample absorption. And for these two, we already have introduced few things earlier. We can have knowledge optical phenomena, for example, development of optical parametric amplifiers, which can give you a lot of other colors from the initial color. You can have white light generation. Using white light generation, I can have a broadband output to short pulse for a probing. Okay, so these are the things which happen. Briefly, pump probe is like this. You excite the pump, excite a material in the ground state. Then you come with a broadband pulse. Okay, then the part of the broadband spectra, which is corresponding to the absorption of the molecule, takes the population from ground state to the excited state. There is a possibility of stimulated emission that happens, and the absorption and the spectral region where this particular stimulated emission happens can be seen as stimulated emission, which is a positive. Okay, because we are talking about delta T. However, there is a spectral region where nothing is happening, but still you see a signal, which is a negative signal. That is because the excited state is absorbing, and that's how one can really start following the excited state absorption. So once the point is here, once the system goes to an excited state, it can get excited to a singlet state, it can go to a triplet state, or it can form charges. So all these processes can be nicely followed with form probe experiment. Okay, one of the earliest experiments which we did with sub-10 femtosecond pulse is studying of pentacene, and this pentacene was found to have a singlet fission of 80 femtoseconds. And don't worry about what singlet fission is. The point which I want to show you is that one can do extremely short temporal resolution in order to find or follow extremely fast, ultra fast events. So here we are talking about femtosecond, 80 femtosecond pulse, and here in this we are able to do the energy transfer dynamics in 50 femtoseconds. So again, we are talking about following chemical reactions, chemical events that is happening at ultra fast, much faster time scales. Another point which I wanted to show you is how one could use this particular technique to study the primary photoisomerization isomerization event in dye. So we see this, like our eyes see, we have retinal cells, and these retinal cells have rhodopsin molecules. Okay, and so one could really start studying how the rhodopsin molecule isomerization is happening. And this experiment, which is in 2010 in Nature paper, really told us why we are able to see so fast, why our eye response is such a fast thing. Okay, this work was done with sub-20 femtosecond. Right. So finally, I would I like to do justice to my own work. So I would present one of my work. Okay. So here we try to show a solar cell with a molecule which is very cheap. Our approach was different. Normally, what people do is they make a solar cell and they do the characterization. We did the opposite. We did pump probe to see if this particular molecule is good for solar cell or not. Okay. So this is what we did. What is a solar cell? I just briefly explain 1 minute. You have a dye which is sensitizing this TiO2. Okay, the idea of this solar cell is that you excite the dye absorbs the light, gets excited, and the electron which is excited in the dye gets injected into the titania. Now once the titania gets the electron, this system is a semiconductor system, so it would have its own mobility of electrons. So electrons gets transported to the cathode, to the anode, okay, and then it goes in this direction. Now this dye which lost its electron is now looking for an electron, and this electron is obtained from the surrounding electrolyte, which is electron rich. Okay, and so what happens? This guy excites, gives an electron. Now this guy doesn't have an electron. It requires an electron. This electron is given by the neighboring electrolyte molecules, and so the electron which is lost in this will be taken from this, and that's how you have the so-called hole transport. Overall, what happens? The electron which is injected comes back and reaches here. So that's how the overall circuit forms, and you have the electric current in the circuit. Now the point here is that the dye should be able to inject electron into the TiO2. Okay, so for that the upper the LUMO, which is lowest upper molecular orbital, unoccupied molecular orbital, should be higher than the conduction band of the TiO2. And so we have done those calculations and we found that they have this matching. And so when we do the experiment with pump probe, we see that there is a good indication of injection, charge injection. Okay, this is the film, and with new fuchsin, we see that there is a negative band which is forming. Don't worry what these bands are there. Just follow my point that with and without TiO2, there is a new band which is appearing, and this negative peak is coming within 2 picoseconds. So we have concluded that this particular system of new fuchsin and dye and TiO2 should be able to inject electron and should be able to work as a solar cell. Okay, then we went about making a solar cell. It gave a very poor solar cell, to 0.02%. People threw it away, but we insisted that it should be able to do work. We find somehow do something to get it work. Okay, so we kept changing the electrolyte. With iodine electrolyte, it didn't work. We changed it to a sodium sulfide electrolyte. It did work a bit. Finally, we moved to a ferrous kind of electrolyte, which is common. And then with a simple change in the electrolyte, we could get 2.88% efficiency. Now, the point which I want to highlight is that fundamentally it was possible to have a solar cell, but because of the material choice, we could never get it. So we pushed the material chemists, solar cell guys, device guys, to keep trying out the right combination, and that way we could give the input from spectroscopy to devise a solar cell which is very, very cheap, because new fuchsin is the kind of the dye which used in Tukul. There is a lot of newspaper articles which have come over it. Please, you can approach me. I'll show you those things. So the components wise, we have done the cost analysis. We see that compared to the standard the license solar cell cost, okay, which is this die is 31,000 per gram. We are talking about 2.5, 2 rupee 50 paise. The counter electrode is platinum, which is used in commercially available one. Our counter electrode is 1 rupee because it's simple carbon fabric. And the KCl solution is very cheap, non-toxic. Overall, we have demonstrated a low-cost aqueous DSSC. Okay, so the point about this entire example is that it's not very high-fi work one need to be done. One can do a standard protocol work and give inputs to the chemist and get good output, good utilities. So this is the femtosecond laser facility we have in the IIT Hyderabad. It is installed, almost installed, let's say, because of pandemic, the engineer had to leave. Once we get it, we will be able to do those works. So ours is a less than 35 femtosecond pulse, output of 55 millijoule and 50 millijoule. We are three, Dr. Vandana and Dr. Bhuvanesh. Vandana ma'am, Dr. Vandana does this kind of few body quantum dynamics lab. So she has developed the fastest camera ever built to look inside molecules. Dr. Bhuvanesh works on laser matter interaction. So he is the guy to talk about high intense, ultra intense. He is the one who does this kind of ion accelerations, etc. So contact these two if you have specific doubts in these points. Okay. So to summarize, what I have done here in this talk is, I have just overshot by 5 minutes. I'm sorry. Is that I have given you from the basic how a femtosecond pulse is generated, what are the properties of the femtosecond pulse, how we can exploit the properties of femtosecond pulse for the various applications that is possible. Okay, so overall I gave you a detailed overview. I won't say complete overview, but a gist of whatever it is. I thank all these funding agencies, my collaborators, my group members, and you're welcome to look at my website, contact me anytime. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Santosh. It was a wonderful presentation. It is informative and interesting. Thank you so much. And quickly, let us take a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
Hello, sir. This is Ramya.
Okay, Ramya.
Thank you for a very effective session. Okay, just I have one query. Okay. Can we determine elemental analysis of a material by using femtosecond and attosecond laser? Like which laser we can prefer?
First, a simple question answer would be that it is too expensive to do that. Okay. Now, elemental analysis, one can you can do femtosecond per laser. So the experiment is called 2-photon photo emission spectroscopy.
Okay.
Okay, you can do that, but it is too expensive to do such things. But yeah, it is possible to do that.
Okay. And one more thing, like while we are doing experiment, like how to check whether CCD detector and chopper and femtosecond laser pulses are synchronizing in case of transient absorption spectroscopy? Like, is there any method to check?
Yes. So now, okay, I'll give you a small trick. Now your CCD is a pixel, right? CCD is a pixel, set of pixels, correct?
Yes.
So you can always take a photodiode after that chopper. Okay, let the photodiode see the light that comes out of the chopper. Okay, so when the light is there after the chopper, the photodiode should detect it, and this detected light should be sent to the pixel. Now you track whether the pixel is showing 0 or 1. Depending upon 0 or 1, you will know whether you are able to have a chopped on or chop off. Okay. Now, when you are recording the pump probe data, okay, where you have a set of spectra, you can always say that when the pixel which sees that particular detector output is 1, I have pump on. When it is 0, it is pump off. Okay, that's how you can collect those data that way. It's a post-processing, one can do it. Now that's how we can synchronize. Otherwise, it's impossible to synchronize.
Okay, thank you, sir. One more thing. How can we determine intrinsic non-radiative decay rate of luminescent materials? Usually, we use TCSPC to find the like radiative decay, right? So,
Okay.
how can we find this non-radiative decay?
Oh yeah. So we have started working on this last couple of years. Okay. One of the answers, one of the ideas which we are having is that we do pump probe. Okay. We do pump probe and we look at the excited state dynamics. Now, all that excited state which has gone up should have to decay fast, right? So we will follow how is the absorption decay happening over the period of time. Then we fit it. We fit the data. We fit the data with certain physical model, photophysical model, and there we put in the idea of the TCSPC lifetime, excited state lifetime with TCSPC, the quantum information of the radiative species, and then one can get the branching ratio, and from that branching ratio one can see how much is non-radiative and how much is radiative, and how much is going into the triplets, which is the intersystem process. I can send you a paper which is published recently on this direction.
Okay, thank you, sir. And one question from the participants.
Yeah.
Suppose if we don't know the material band gap, how can we select the filters in case of photochemistry?
I don't understand the question. Can you repeat it again?
Suppose if we don't know the material band gap,
Okay.
so how can we select the filters?
For what experiment he wants the particular? What is the
In case
question?
of, she is asking like, I would like to know how to select filter when we are not sure about material band gap for photochemistry.
I would say always do the absorption spectra, because absorption spectroscopy is low light, low energy, low light emission, right? So systems will not go bad. Don't put in laser directly. You take in absorption spectra of the material. If it is a transparent material, you should be able to take absorption spectra. So based on that, one can look at what is the transparency window of that particular material, and from that transparency window, one can really understand it. It's not necessary that you should know the band gap of every material system. It is important that you should know where it is absorbing, where it is not absorbing, if you want to use the experiments, especially for photochemistry.
Okay, fine. And one more question from the participants. What is the main difference between WLC and the white light that has taken with the same spectral content?
Yes. It is the same idea like incandescent white light and a femtosecond and a laser light. The idea about the white light continuum is that even though we have a spectra or a possibility of lot of frequencies which is coming, okay, broadband spectra, each of the wavelength do act like an individual femtosecond pulse. They would have the same directionality, same coherence, the same how to call the pulse duration. I won't say the same pulse duration, but they are not like, they will not be different, totally different to the input pulse. So they would maintain the input radiation characteristics, and so a white light which is generated with femtosecond pulse can be used as a probe. Because if you remember the slide I said about pump probe, you need to have the cross correlation between pump duration and probe duration to be as small as possible in order to look at the dynamical information. And so if you want to excite with a femtosecond pulse, you need to probe with a femtosecond pulse. And this is the only way you can probe with the femtosecond pulse of different wavelengths. Okay, so to put it in simple terms, a white light continuum output is still a laser, whereas a normal white light which of the same spectral content that comes out of a any other source is an incandescent. There is no, it's like a normal incoherent low energy output. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah.